Hey guys, it's me, Bo. I'm back here on the Film Scene Investigation channel. Thank you for checking out this video. In today's review, I'm going to be taking a look at White Palace. Now, this was a movie that was recently suggested to me. I checked out one of James Spader's movies, Secretary, reviewed that for the channel. And yeah, through conversation online, someone said I should check White Palace out. I looked into the synopsis, I saw the trailer on YouTube, and yeah, it looked pretty interesting, so I thought I'd check it out. Just before we get into the review, guys, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. All the support is greatly appreciated. So, White Palace from October 1990 was a movie that was directed by the filmmaker Louis Mandoki and was based on the novel by author Glenn Savan. Shot on location in St. Louis, Missouri, the film went on to make around about $17 million in box office sales, making it a fairly successful film. When it comes to the story, it focused on the character Max Barron, a young, well-educated man who was played by actor James Spader. At the time of meeting him, he was still very much in the grieving process after recently losing his wife. Of course, he was doing his best to cope, but it was a struggle, especially since Max was still living in the same home he shared with his late wife. One night, Max attended a party and he brought along with him some fast food to share amongst his friends. But while Max was very much in the mood to enjoy himself, very quickly it was discovered that the fast food was wrong. There were missing items, burgers that weren't there, and Max basically was just really pissed off by the situation. And so he decided that he was going to make a stand and go all the way back to the restaurant to, get a refund, I guess. While all of his friends were saying to him, it's really not a big deal, I think deep down Max was kind of embarrassed, with the situation. So he headed back. And this was when we met the character Nora, who was played by actress Susan Sarandon, a middle-aged waiter who was working in the White Palace diner. When we saw her, she was rushed off her feet. She was tired, she was overworked. There seemed to be no one else really kind of, in charge of the restaurant itself. And then you had Max just barging in and, demanding his money back. Nora wasn't exactly thrilled with this guy randomly coming up to her face and demanding a refund. But since Max was causing such a scene, and since there were so many other customers to serve, Nora just decided to accept, it was her fault, and gave him the money back. Once he got his money, Max seemed, a lot more chilled about it and just kind of walked out, ending the dispute. And that's where you thought that was it between them. But actually later that night, when Max went to a local bar for a drink, once again bumped into Nora. Of course, this was completely unexpected, and once Max saw Nora, he immediately recognized her from the White Palace restaurant. He wasn't too happy to see her, but Nora, on the other hand, well, she was pretty drunk at that point, and wanted to start up a conversation. Nora was going on about this, that, and whatever, and Max, he wasn't really paying attention. It was just small talk between two people. But eventually, they did start to connect once they realized that they were both in the grieving process, having recently lost some loved ones. While these two people were from completely two different backgrounds, through grief, they were able to find a connection and start to relate to each other. The couple ended up spending the night together at Nora's apartment. Completely unexpected, but as I said, they had this connection, one thing led to another, and it was quite clear that there was an attraction between the two. Yes, they had their differences, but that didn't seem to stop them, and it kind of reminds me of that old saying, opposites attract. In the coming days and weeks, Max and Nora continued on this relationship, growing closer together each day. But it didn't take long for the cracks to appear in their relationship. One of Max's friends ended up getting married and, of course, invited Max. And this would have been a perfect opportunity for Max to introduce Nora, his new love interest, to all of his friends and family. But he decided not to. He went alone, and very quickly, once Nora found out, accused Max of cheating, thinking that he had taken, some other woman to the wedding. Nora quite rightly felt pushed out, like she wasn't good enough to meet Max's friends and family. But that just actually wasn't the case. It wasn't about that. Deep down, Max was still struggling, to come to terms with the fact that his wife, his wife that he'd loved, that he'd married, was gone. In his mind, Max felt that he was in some ways betraying the memory of his wife. Of course, that wasn't the case, but as I said, it was like this psychological barrier that he was dealing with. Even though Max had genuine feelings for Nora, he had a hard time accepting that and moving on with his life. Now, this nicely ties in to the themes of the movie, with White Palace exploring grief through the characters of both Max and Nora. The grief was pivotal as it binded both characters together, with Max losing his wife and Nora losing her son to illness. These were two people that were clearly deeply affected by their loss, but through that were able to make a connection and, which sparked their relationship. So yeah, taking all that into account, I think it's fair to say that White Palace does give hope to its audience, showing that even if someone is deeply affected by loss, there's always, a new horizon, right? The sun will rise again and all is not lost. There's always new opportunities around the corner. And with that, I also feel that change was a big theme, a big part that played into the story. You had both characters very much at the start of the film set in their ways, with, Max being somewhat of a pompous, show-off, and Nora being this kind of very gritty, hard-working woman. Two completely different backgrounds. But over time, both characters were able to shed their preconceived ideas about one another. We saw that character arc with both characters kind of losing or letting go of their inhibitions and, taking a risk and jumping into a new relationship. Now, before we get on to the performances, I did want to talk about the scene in which Nora and Max first got it together at her apartment. Max was drunk. Well, they both were, but Max was very drunk, and he ended up passing out on Nora's bed, only to be later awoken by Nora giving him oral sex. At first, quite rightly, Max was, unsure what was going on. I mean, he was still drunk. He had just been abruptly awoken and, was trying to piece everything together. He eventually did, and the two went on to have sex. This would kickstart their relationship together. And, while the whole thing was kind of romanticized, I can't help but state the obvious, which was that Nora had forced herself onto Max without his consent. I'm not going to get into a big discussion about consent and sexual harassment and all that kind of stuff, but I just say that when I saw all of this play out in front of me, I couldn't help but think, what if the roles had been reversed? I have to point this out. What if a drunk woman had been awoken by a man that she barely knew who was performing, oral sex on her. I think most people would immediately think, assault. And I think that's a key thing to remember here, that yes, Max knew Nora, Nora knew Max, but they had only known each other for, a few hours. They were basically strangers. Ultimately, they, had sex, they got it together, they started a relationship. So, I guess it didn't really make a major difference to the story. But I just found it very interesting how the whole scene was presented. I understand what the filmmakers were attempting here by giving the Nora character some agency and subverting the gender norms. But, in reality, what she did was messed up, especially given that there was alcohol involved. I guess I just bring this up because, we are living in a time post the Me Too movement where such things, all the harassment of women is being called out, and rightfully so, of course. But it works both ways. And I just found it interesting how a Hollywood movie from the 90s can just kind of gloss over basically, sexual assault. That's basically what it was. What if Max had not consented to then having sex with her? What if? Would have been a pretty awkward moment, right? So, I guess just from watching the film and having the mindset, of someone living in the 21st century, it was a crazy scene, to be honest with you. It was, kind of dark. Separately to all of this, I also noticed how the filmmakers leaned in to the Jewish stereotypes, with Max's family being very rich. Now, this, of course, played into the storyline, with Max being reluctant to show off his new girlfriend, Nora, to his friends and family because he feared their judgment. She was the complete opposite of what Max's family would expect. So, what we're talking about here is social prejudice. And once that was established, that definitely raised some tensions within the narrative. It wasn't like Max's family were horrible to Nora. No, they were very friendly. But I think it was quite obvious that she was an outsider and, she was never going to be part of the family. And so with that, and with the kind of underhanded, snidey remarks, it was that triggered Max into realizing that yes, Nora was the right woman for him, and yes, he was going to commit to her. When it comes to the performances, I thought Susan Sarandon was fantastic as Nora, bringing this raw vulnerability to her character. Nora was a woman who was happy to speak her mind. There were no airs and graces with her. She was kind of unfiltered in that sense. And even though I think on the outside, it may have seemed that she had this rough exterior, watching the film, I think it was clear that Nora, deep down, had a good heart. She was very much a caring person. But unfortunately, due to the loss of her son, Nora just kind of lost her way somehow. Now, I've been aware of Susan Sarandon for many years. I understand that she's, a big-time actress who's celebrated in Hollywood. But to be honest, up until watching White Palace, I'd never really appreciated her ability and skills as an actress. I guess in some ways, I just never really paid attention to Sarandon's career. I think I may have seen Thelma and Louise at one point, but I never really kind of rated her. But after, seeing her in White Palace, oh yeah, she's very talented. I see why she's so celebrated now in Hollywood. But it wasn't just her performance. I actually thought that her on-screen chemistry with her co-star James Spader was very strong. and very believable. Like I've said many times, if you have a movie that's basically centered around two people, a love story, then hey, it's absolutely imperative that you get the casting right and making sure that those actors have chemistry. And they did. So yeah, great casting for sure. As for James Spader, he delivered a very understated performance as a tortured man who was trying to cope with this depression and grief through the loss of his wife. Unlike his co-star Susan Sarandon, who had moments of kind of anger and frustration, Spader's character, Max Baron, was a lot more subtle in his emotions and a lot more reserved. And, it was the subtleties that actually showed the transformation from the beginning, when Max was pretty much, this quintessential 80s yuppie, to becoming a lot more open-minded and, just a man who's trying to deal with grief. Spader was very good. And, he also, like his co-star, brought this vulnerability to his character, which, kind of added some sentimental value to the narrative. As for the supporting cast, I thought everyone was okay. I mean, there wasn't really much of a platform for anyone else to really show off their skills. This was very much a very focused story on both Max and Nora. So we saw Jason Alexander at one point show up, and there was no one bad, but it's not really worth talking about. It really was all about Spader and Sarandon. And so, dislikes for White Palace from 1990. My biggest dislike for the film would have to be the ending, as for me, it felt way too predictable. So the setup to this was that both Nora and Max had a disagreement. Nora decided to leave for New York and start a new life there. Max would then go on to find out and chased after her. Nora ended up working at some restaurant in downtown New York. Max showed up and, the two ended up getting it together. While it wasn't necessarily that bad, man, I could have seen this coming a mile away. As soon as Nora left for New York, immediately I was like, how many more scenes until we see Max chase after her, which he did. It wasn't necessarily bad. It was just, like he showed up, they go together, everything played out as expected. I was hoping that something might happen. I don't know, maybe she would reject him or they wouldn't get it together. But no, they did. And as I said, just very, very predictable. And another thing that I really didn't like was also its execution. As one of the last moments before the credits rolled was we saw Max and Nora embrace, and they were both laying on this dinner table. they were smooching. The customers and all the staff were clapping. Hey, well, great. This is great. I mean, it's like, just, that did take me out of the movie a little bit, because for a movie to end like that, in my eyes, that's an ending to a romantic comedy, not a romantic drama. And, while this isn't necessarily a very dark movie, it's certainly not a comedy by any stretch of the imagination. It just wasn't in sync with the rest of the movie. Now, I understand that the filmmakers, their hands were tied because White Palace was based on a novel, so they can't, start, changing this and changing that. But still, just the delivery of which we saw it happen and take place, there could have been, they could have done something better, I feel. In an ideal world, Max would have gone after Nora. That makes sense. But I feel that he would have most likely confronted her in private, not in front of dozens of customers. With something like that, or maybe even with, if Nora rejected him, that would feel a lot more realistic and in line with what we'd seen previously. But this ending was like, I don't know, something you'd see out of like When Harry Met Sally, or, something like that. It was just kind of cliche, very romanticized where it didn't need to be. And I guess, my enjoyment was kind of diminished towards the end because everything played out as it, I guess was to. But man, it was so generic. There wasn't anything really, there was no stakes for me, It just didn't align. And yeah, I really didn't like the ending. As I said, it was so generic. And so, ratings for White Palace from 1990. I'm going to be rating this movie a solid 4.9 out of 10. The best way I could, summarize White Palace was that it was a journey of self-discovery explored through the lens of a widower. Now, while at times, yes, the story beats were somewhat predictable, the fact that you had two high-caliber actors, one in James Spader and the other in Susan Sarandon, well, their involvement, it elevated the material, and, well, that kind of separated it, making it more than just your typical romantic love story. This movie often gets cited as being underappreciated and underrated. I would agree with that. It is. I think it's also fair to say that this movie isn't necessarily a standout. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have any mind-blowing originality, but I still think it's very, very relatable. We've all gone through loss, and as we get older, we will continue to. It is a part of life. And I did appreciate the film at least giving some kind of positive outlook to those who may be suffering from that. If you've seen White Palace, then please let me know your thoughts and memories in the comment section below. For all you guys out there who haven't seen this one yet, the best way I could summarize would be, if you're a fan of James Spader, or if you're a fan of Susan Sarandon, then absolutely, you got to check this out. Their performances are the best thing about this movie. And well, that's all from me today, guys. I do hope you've enjoyed this review of White Palace from 1990. Of course, I'll be back next week with yet another cult movie review. Just want to say a big thank you to all my current subscribers. I really do appreciate your support. And for everyone else, take care.